Hi folks, with Tacitus today. Your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Germany in the late 1930s, say 1936 through 1938, early 1939, that sort of thing. And the travellers from not only the United States, but elsewhere around Europe that were travelling through Europe or through Britain, France, and elsewhere, and into Germany as well. Now, a number of these travellers and commentators, some of them quite experienced travellers, were commenting on how upbeat and positive and spring in the step and all this sort of thing that the Germans had around this time. So again, 1936 through 38, that sort of time period. And by contrast, how gloomy and downbeat and the seeming, consumed by futility and this sort of thing, how the British and French were quite the opposite. It was very difficult to find any positive sort of view of things in Britain or France. France seemed to be caught up in this permanent state of gloom and a sense of impending doom. There was a communist, a Jewish communist sort of government in France there, Leon Blum. Britain was so sort of determined to balance the economic books that they were, the people there were the depression was still very real and very potent into the late 1930s. There was lots of class conflict, strikes, industrial strife. It seemed that the country was in the grip of the future looked very gloomy as far as a lot of people could see it, again in France and Britain, brought on by the fallout from the First World War and then, of course, the Great Depression. But why was it so different in Germany? Why were the Germans so upbeat, according at least to these travellers and observers? This would seem to be held out by sort of other sort of, I suppose, anecdotal to some extent, but also hard numbers. The expendable income and the purchasing power of German citizens was starting to move noticeably ahead of people in France and Germany. Unemployment was coming down very quickly in Germany, and the sort of consumer goods and the price of certain consumer goods, things like cameras, that sort of stuff, which are relatively new technology in the day, or personal sort of size cameras, they were consumer goods available to Germans at a competitive price that were not available in the same way in other parts of the world now. So there are very real reasons why the Germans would be upbeat, and there are also things that the Hitler's government was putting in place, like the beautification of areas. So if you had a factory, the Nazi government was saying, well, don't just have bare sort of land around it. Beautify, have flowers, have trees, have little parks and little areas where people can sit outside and have their lunch or have a picnic or something. Create ponds with ducks in them, and they were very focused on beautifying things like industrial. Well, today we would call an industrial park, but this was a very different environment, and some commentators said it was almost like walking into a different world when you came to Germany. Again, the upbeat spring in the step, the positive attitude and view that the people had was palpable and it was noticeable. But stop, you say, wait. You mean, do you mean Nazi Germany? Do you mean the fascist Germany? Do you mean swastika Germany? Is that what you mean? Are you trying to say that? Well, yeah, based on the observation of these people who, this is well before any discussion of mass murder of Jews or anything. So people are taking an objective view of things, an objectivity that's very hard to find, if not impossible to find today. So why is that? Why, not only why were the Germans again so positive and upbeat, or certainly based on the observations of these, but why was it that the British and the French were almost the complete opposite of that? Now, wherever Hitler went, he was being mobbed by crowds, and they wanted his autograph and this sort of thing. But no, stop! This is evil, Nazi, fascist, swastika, Hitler. That can't be true. He was, everybody in Germany has been killed and oppressed. They've all been thrown in prison and beaten to death and shot. Little babies were torn limb. No, stop. Let's get away from the drama and the propaganda here. Unemployment had been very high before Hitler's government came to power. Now unemployment was low. The standard of living of Germans was lower than Britain and France before Hitler came in. Now their standard of living was higher and their purchasing power was greater. People had jobs, they had purchasing power. They were looking at the future through a very positive lens, and why not? The British and the French, by contrast, their standard of living was declining, unemployment was high, soup kitchen lines and bread lines was long. There were dispossessed people sort of living hand to mouth and sleeping under bridges and overpasses and this sort of thing. And there were a lot of those people. There were these transient sort of populations of unskilled labourers all over the place. So this was a very different environments. And again, the class conflict in Britain and France, the ideological conflict, the struggle between the Marxists, the communists and the nationalists and this and that, and then going on in France, that was an ongoing thing. It was more a class thing in Germany than in Britain than straight out political ideology, as you were seeing in France. But nonetheless, these countries were convulsed in disputation and petty bickering over everything. And whereas Germany seemed unified and focused, they had a sense of purpose, and this was a difference. And if any human being anywhere in the world is going to prefer a situation where they've got a job and they've got purchasing power, they can look after their family, they can afford consumer goods, and they can afford vacations and this, of course they're going to take a positive view of that, and why not? Now, I remember in say, going back to high school even, where this period of Weimar transitioning to Nazi Germany and all this sort of stuff, it was very simplified that Hitler came to power or came to government, and he just put everyone to work in armaments factories. That was it. So suddenly, the very next day, millions of people were working in armaments factories, and that's why World War II happened. And so this is, of course, utter and absolute nonsense. The amount of armaments production that went on in Germany on a relative basis was actually pretty small in the overall scheme of things. That they had a substantial economy and a lot of highly skilled engineers, mass industrial, because they had that infrastructure to do it, was how they produced. But Hitler didn't pull the lever for full mobilization of industrial resources for warfare until 1943, when the war had already been going on for a few years. So this idea that everyone suddenly went to work in armaments factories is utter and absolute nonsense. So how was it achieved? Well, I don't want to get into the weeds in this one because it would take too long. But they used very imaginative ways of developing industry, not dissimilar, by the way, to some of the moves that the communists did in the Soviet Union. So instead of people buying, as in business to business sort of relation, instead of one company having to buy the raw material, they would do, if you like, swapping. So, well, you give us the coal and we'll give you the steel. So they used, in effect, what we could reasonably call a bartering system to try and jumpstart the economy so that goods and services were actually moving around, but rather than a straight out financial transaction, they initially began the process by, and again, I'm simplifying this a little bit, but by bartering. And it was very successful in, and the team of economists and so on that Hitler hired to do the work were considered, even to this day, certainly expert in their field, and play, Dr. Jacques and so on, playing a pivotal role in that, and they were very successful at organising the economy. And this was really what was going on. So people were being employed in jobs, not in there were somewhere, but by far and away the majority of new jobs were created in consumer goods industries, such as making things like cameras, or I don't know, women's stockings, and cosmetics, all sorts of things. There were people employed in armaments, but not very many. There were also quite a few people employed in, say, public works, like the autobahns and that sort of stuff, which even today are heralded as masterpieces of engineering and planning. So the Nazis were adding quite a lot of value to and giving people a sense of, hey, things are happening, things are moving, my life is good. So why wouldn't they feel positive about it? Now, this contrasts sharply with, well, they're Nazis, they're fascists. They killed everybody. There was no one left in Germany because everyone was shot dead. You go, no. If you were a Jewish, homosexual, gypsy, Marxist, communist revolutionary, things would not go well for you. I mean, let's be clear about that. Things would not go well. And those sort of people were being arrested and thrown in prison and so on. So there's no question of that. But they wouldn't even represent 1 in 100 people. Remember that the entire Jewish population of Germany, and we're talking, 70 plus million people, pushing 80 million people in total. The entire population, the Jewish population of Germany, was about 400,000 when the Nazis came to power. And the Nazis encouraged and said they would aid and abet and assist with translators and all sorts of things, Jewish people that wanted to leave Germany and go to other countries, such as the United States, for example. And around half of the Jewish population did go, emigrate to places like the United States or, Canada, Australia, or whatever, or other European countries. So that left, give or take, about 200,000 Jewish people in Germany. So we're talking, a quarter or less than a quarter of 1% of the population was Jewish. I mean, let me just say that again: less than a quarter of 1% of the population was Jewish. And if you throw in the Marxist revolutionaries, many of whom were Jewish as well, and who, by the way, were rejected, most of whom were rejected as possible immigrants to other places in the world. Nobody wants a firebrand shit stirrer to come in as a migrant. So those people were left. So a very high proportion of those were activist, revolutionary Marxists, the ones remaining in Germany and so on. So the people, and if you look at the gypsies that had come in, during the porous borders after World War I and that sort of thing, they were invited to leave, go back to Romania, that sort of thing. And so there was a very small population of activists, Marxist revolutionaries, those sorts of people, and it was easily far less than 1% of the population. So those were the people that, if you wanted to look, well, they were having their rights taken away, or they were being dragged into kangaroo courts, or those. Well, yes, and there's a lot to be said for that, evidence to be put forward on that. But for 99.55% of the population of Germany, their legal rights were fine, absolutely fine. Were they getting regular elections or these sorts of things? Well, no. That you could argue, plebiscites, but not elections. Did the Nazis stop the other parties, particularly the revolutionary and the socialist parties, from participating in the government and so on, members of the Reichstag and so on? Well, yes, they did that. There's no question of that. But did Hitler and his government deliver on their promises? Well, they were pretty good. You'd have to give them an A+ on delivering on those promises, and they did in terms of the economy and growing the economy, jobs and so on. They also, instead of hating on Germany, which had become a bit of a pastime, saying that all Germans are bad and Germany's bad and German history is evil, and so instead of that, the Nazis took the view of, well, why should German schools teach German children to hate Germany? We should teach our children to revere our accomplishments and achievements. Now, it just so happens that in the case of the wider sort of Germanic diaspora, there's a lot of accomplishments. Whether it's in philosophy, Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or something, music, Mozart and Wagner and so on, or engineering or chemical engineering. In fact, any form of engineering and industrial, the Germans were at the apex of all that and had been for quite some time. So there's a lot to talk about, to revere and exalt the achievements and accomplishments of the German people. So that was put into the curriculum, and so you'd struggle to fault what was going on in Germany. And of course, remember, we're looking back before the mass murder of Jews, so this is before that. Travelers around Europe were noticing it. And there were a lot of people saying, well, gee whiz, if that's the fascist sort of form of government, where it's not so much rights are taken away, but rights are sort of melded, the rights of the workers, the union, the role of unions, the role of business, the role of government, we're all on the same page here. We're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is a better standard of living for Germans and a wealthier Germany. And we're all sort of, wanting that. That doesn't mean that captains of industry should not profit. It doesn't mean that unions should not have a role in negotiating pay rates and say we all have our role, but we should all be moving in the one direction. And this was something that was seen as not necessarily unique, but something that now remember, the Germans were not being coerced into this. It's not like the Soviet Union or the communist societies where you're not allowed to leave. You speak out against the government and they'll kill you or put you in gulags and these sorts of things. That's not the same. The German people were supporting this government because it was delivering to them better standard of living, better quality of life, this sort of thing. And that needs to be recognized, whereas the British government and the French government were deemed as having comprehensively failed in delivering better conditions and better quality of life. And again, they seem to be unable to prevent the sorts of strife, whether it's ideological, political, communist type stuff in France or class-based type conflict in Britain. It doesn't matter, but the governments were seen as being unable to deliver better outcomes, and thus was the type of democracy that was being experienced in Britain and France had that failed, or the United States for that, so had that failed. And the Great Depression brought in this sort of government structure has failed. What else can we do? There's the communist model out there that's very brutal. If you don't agree with them, they'll kill you, for goodness sakes. Or there's the fascist one, and that's a lot gentler, and one that seeks to gain the support of the people, not necessarily through the ballot box, but to gain the support of people by delivering on the promises that they make. And this was very much part of the wider thinking at the time. But it's certainly illustrative when we look at how the evil fascist Nazi Hitler swastika, how it was delivering to the people and delivering better quality of life throughout. But they didn't have the right to vote every year. To what extent did that matter if your government is benevolent and delivering? Whereas the British and the French, they were having elections every 5 minutes, but still were gloomy as fuck. That's something worth considering in the overall scheme of things. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.